Hey everyone, AMD's X3D gaming CPUs are widely known to be some of the fastest gaming chips on the planet, leading to many people say that you must have an X3D chip if you're a gamer, and whilst they are very good chips, especially for gaming, it's not entirely correct to say that you should blindly run out and buy one. Last month I actually did a head-to-head comparison of the Ryzen 7700 and the Ryzen 7800 X3D CPU, and whilst the 3D CPU was ahead, in some cases it was actually kind of close, and that's because X3D CPUs don't always work the way some people expect, which I wanted to explore in this video, which is sponsored by AliExpress and their 11/11 shopping festival. More on that later. But for now, my first point is that some people online say that because the X3D chips have that stacked cache, that they're automatically, the best thing you can possibly buy for gaming, and whilst obviously the extra X3D cache does help, it also depends on the genre of games that you play. For example, if you're really into MMORPGs like World of Warcraft and Final Fantasy XIV, then they do really benefit from, the extra X3D cache because there's so much going on in the game with the extra players and lots of fast movement that the extra 3D cache really does help there. And this also applies to things like flight simulator games and the Total War series and games like that where you've got lots of stuff happening and lots of complex calculations. So that's great, and that's a big tick for X3D CPUs. But if you've got other games which are very graphically intensive, maybe a single player shooter, then the CPU might matter a bit less. I mean, it's still important, and I'll come back to this point later, but actually, the GPU is going to be a lot more important than that extra 3D cache there. The next factor that I wanted to discuss is the resolution, because gaming at 4K and 1440p don't always show off the full strength of an X3D CPU, and I'll talk about that in just 1 minute. But first, a word from our sponsor, money. If you're looking to save money, AliExpress has you covered. They've got an 11/11 shopping festival on right now for a short time only. It's full of big discounts, millions of coupon codes, and a lucky box draw. To get started, scan the QR code on screen now, or check out the links in the description to join the Tech Override team. And while you're there, grab the coupon codes to save yourself even more money. Thanks again to AliExpress for sponsoring this video. Now back to the resolution point, and this is debated quite a lot because sometimes the difference between a non-X3D CPU and an X3D CPU can be massive, but it depends on the resolution. And I tend to do lots of video editing, so I got 4K monitors, and as a result when I game, I also game at 4K quite a lot. And the problem with 4K gaming is that often, there's so many pixels to render that the choice of your graphics card is incredibly important. In other words, in my benchmarking last month, I often seen that the GPU was the limiting factor. So you might have a game with the GPU is like 95 to 100% in use, and any CPU, whether it's an X3D chip or not, was at like 20 or 30% utilization because I was gaming at 4K. And that's a key point, is that just having an X3D chip isn't some magic panacea that's going to make your really budget graphics card suddenly shine and perform really well, especially at higher resolutions. But of course, if you are considering gaming at like 1080p or maybe 1440p with a really high refresh rate monitor like 360Hz or whatever, then an X3D chip will come into its own more, because when you do lower the resolution, your GPU is a bit less important then than the CPU, or to put it another way, the CPU and the GPU are a little bit more on par with each other and less likely to bottleneck each other. And as I mentioned, it's not just about the average FPS number. The 1% lows actually matter quite a lot as well for like gaming, immersion and things like that. And I'll come back to that point in a minute, but firstly I wanted to discuss overclocking, because the older X3D chips like the 5800 X3D and the 7800 X3D are locked for overclocking. And I've got a 7800 X3D in my gaming system. It's brilliant and I don't actually see the need to overclock it. But if you are a massive fan of overclocking, you've just got to know that those older X3D chips are locked for overclocking in the normal way. And that's because of how the earlier X3D CPUs were actually designed, because effectively you've got the CCD where all the cores are located, and in those earlier X3D chips, the actual cache was sort of stacked on top of the cores in the CCD in a particular area that meant that things were a little bit fragile, and fragile is probably the wrong word, but essentially when it came to overclocking, a chip like the 7800 X3D would struggle if you just, whacked up the base multiplier, and that's why it's locked. You can still do things like PBO, but just with those older X3D CPUs, you can't do the standard base overclocking. However, you can do this with the newer X3D CPUs from the 9000 series, like the 9800 X3D. For my next point, sometimes online you see people, pick apart benchmarks from like Hardware Unboxed, and they'll sort of take an average FPS number, and then they'll sort of say, right, there's no point of buying that particular CPU because it only performs, 2% better than another CPU that's 10% cheaper. And that is kind of true, and I sort of shown that a little bit in my head-to-head comparison from last month, but that doesn't tell the full story, because any good gaming benchmark will not just show the average FPS number, but it's also going to show the 1% lows and the 0.1% lows. And this kind of tracks how smooth the game feels, because if you're gaming and in general you've got good FPS rates, but every so often things are dipping down and you're having lots of stutters, then that can completely kill immersion. You know, like if you're constantly getting 100 FPS and it feels really smooth, but then you also get lots of little stutters or lag spikes, that is really going to kill your gaming experience. And the X3D CPUs are incredibly good at avoiding that. That's actually one of their big strengths and one of the big reasons why you might want to buy an X3D chip over a non-X3D chip, because the actual 3D cache on the CPU means that the CPU doesn't need to go outside itself as much, and go outside itself is the wrong term, but effectively the extra X3D cache means that more can sort of stay within the CPU, and as a result that actually reduces micro stutters. For my next point, I wanted to discuss something that I find really interesting, but some people might find a bit nerdy, and it's local cooling density. Bear with me on this. So basically the X3D cache obviously has stacked cache. That's the whole point. So instead of having flat cache, you've kind of got stacked cache offering the extra cache, and that's why it's called 3D, because, you know, it's more three-dimensional than flat 2D cache. And the older chips like the 5800X3D and the 7800X3D actually tend to stack that cache directly on top of the CCD and the cores in a particular sort of location, which is why overclocking is an issue, by the way. And basically that location can get very hot relative to the rest of the IHS. So when that chip first came out, some reviewers were sort of noticing these big temperature spikes and swings and things, and then saying, you know, oh, you need to water cool your particular CPU. And thankfully, that's not true. You don't need a really expensive fancy cooler for a chip like the 5800X3D or the 7800X3D, but it is worth knowing that because of the physical design of where that 3D cache is, it means that sometimes if you're looking at benchmarking data, you're going to get temperature swings with a chip like the 7800X3D, which you might not have as much with like the 9800X3D. But to be honest, this is a more minor point. I wouldn't worry about it. I'm just bringing it up because I find it interesting. But last month when I did my benchmarking, you can actually see that the 7800X3D was using less power than the Ryzen 7700, which is in theory, you know, a cheaper and weaker CPU. So effectively, you know, my X3D CPU was getting better gaming performance, better average FPS, better 1% lows, and then using less power. Which brings me on to my next point, is that, you know, these X3D chips are marketed as gaming processors. You know, that term is all over AMD's marketing for the X3D chips, but if you're doing a lot of productivity and professional work, then an X3D chip might not be the right choice for you. I mean, it might be, and I'll talk about that in just a minute, but if you look at the Ryzen 7700 and 7800X3D, it boosts to 5.3 GHz, whereas the X3D chip boosts to 5 GHz. And when you've got productivity type applications, maybe, you know, Blender for 3D modeling, or, you know, video editing in DaVinci Resolve or Premiere Pro, then sometimes actually having cores that can boost, you know, higher can actually be a good thing. So that is one reason why you might be better off with a non-X3D chip than an X3D chip, although I should point out that you have got chips like the 7900X3D that comes with 12 cores, and it also boosts up to 5.6 GHz. And that brings me to my final point, which is that Moore's law is dead. Bear with me on this. So in 1967, Gordon Moore made a famous prediction, which was that every 2 years, the number of transistors on a PCB would actually double. And over the past couple of decades, we've seen some, you know, CPU and GPU launches that have been brilliant. Like I remember when the original Ryzen CPUs launched, they were completely brilliant, especially compared to the older CPUs. And then you had Nvidia's RTX 30 series that came out claiming that they had twice the computing power as the RTX 20 series, which was a huge step forward. However, now we're starting to hit against the laws of physics. You know, microchips are so unbelievably small when you look at the nanometers that, yeah, the laws of physics are just being hit against. And as a result, Moore's law is increasingly dead. But as a result of that, we're moving away from a world where, you know, gen-on-gen hardware improvements is super important, and moving into a world where software is more improvement. And by that, I mean upscaling and frame generation. So when you're gaming, you might turn on DLSS upscaling, for example, or FSR or XeSS upscaling. And what that will do is internally, if you're gaming at like 4K, it might actually internally render the game at like 1440p or even 1080p, and then it'll upscale it back to the 4K final image that you want. And as we know, the X3D chips perform better at like 1080p and 1440p. So even if you've got a high resolution monitor, because Moore's law is dead and we live in more in a sort of software-based world, I think that actually X3D chips are increasingly increasingly important compared to non-X3D chips. So if you can afford an X3D chip, I would very highly recommend it. Like I recently upgraded from the 7700 to the 7800 X3D, two chips which on paper are very, very similar, but in practice I was seeing a noticeable improvement with the X3D chip. I had the 7800 X3D, and I buy lots of these chips from AliExpress, who, as I mentioned at the start, are the sponsor of this video, and they have some really good deals on 7800 X3D CPUs along with other CPUs. So if you wanted to check them out, you can look at the links in the description, and there's a bunch of discount codes there too. That wraps up this video, but if you've got any further questions, please leave them in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, please click the thumbs up button, and please subscribe to see more videos like this. Thanks for watching.